The doctor was about to begin the autopsy when he saw a slight movement in the body's eyelids, and what he discovered next left him in shock. The cold room of the mortuary was filled with a silence that hurt his ears. All he could hear was the constant ticking of the wall clock. There were days when he wanted to take it out of the room or throw it out the window. Dr. Ramiro Castañeda arranged the instruments in a row, as if he were organizing his thoughts. The scalpel, the saw, the forceps, the sterile cloth, everything in its usual place. It was the only thing left in his life that was in order. He calmly put on his gown, adjusted his gloves, and took a deep breath. In front of him on the steel table lay the body of a young woman, 20, maybe 25 years old. Her skin had not yet lost all its color. Her blonde hair was stuck to her forehead, and a strand fell over her half-closed eyes. Ramiro looked at the file. Female, unnamed, found on the sidewalk near the bus terminal, about 200 meters from where an electronic music festival was being held. Diagnosis: cardiorespiratory arrest, suspected overdose. He closed the folder slowly and spoke softly, as if asking permission. Well, let's begin. It was an old habit of his to always speak to each body before the autopsy. He believed that the least he could do was treat them with respect. He turned on the cold light above the table. The lamp screeched, casting a harsh light on the young woman's face. For a moment, Ramiro paused. Her skin still felt warm. He touched her wrist with his fingertips. Nothing. He took the body temperature thermometer. 34 degrees, a little high for someone who had supposedly been dead for hours, but he dismissed the thought. Maybe it was just the air from the generator that kept the room cooler. He grabbed the scalpel. The sound of metal hitting the tray echoed throughout the room. As he adjusted the sheet, he noticed the girl's hands. Short nails painted old rose, but all chipped, as if she hadn't changed her nail polish in weeks. On her left arm, a small band-aid, like from a recent injection. On her wrists, old, fine, discreet marks. Poor thing, he murmured, almost without a voice. What happened to you, eh? Her calm face seemed to hide a very deep tiredness. There was no one waiting outside. No family, no documents, nothing. A whole life, and no one to say her name. Ramiro pulled the sheet up to the young woman's neck, took a deep breath and wrote in the report, "Unidentified body, young woman, possible cause of death, accidental overdose." He looked at her face once more, her long eyelashes, her mouth slightly open. For a moment he felt something strange in his chest, a memory that he pushed away. He couldn't let himself get carried away. Not there. He took the scalpel firmly, but before touching the skin, he bowed his head and made a small sign of the cross, an old gesture that no one in that hospital made anymore. "May God welcome you, daughter." The sound of the clock seemed to stop for a second. The scalpel trembled slightly between Dr. Ramiro's fingers. He placed the blade on the young woman's chest, preparing to make the first cut. He had to check her kidneys and liver to see if it really was an overdose. Everything was silent. Only the sound of the clock in the background marking time. Tick-tock, tick-tock. But something made him stop. A small chill ran down his neck, as if someone were watching him. Ramiro looked up. Her eyes were closed, but there was something strange. Her skin still had color, a lightness that was impossible in someone who was already dead. He carefully touched her neck, searching for a pulse. Nothing. He moved closer to her face, trying to feel some air. He couldn't feel any breath, and he returned to his position. The scalpel blade approached the skin, and then there was an almost invisible movement, a flicker, as if she were having nightmares. He jerked back, and the scalpel slipped and hit the tray with a clang that echoed throughout the room. He muttered, unable to believe what he was seeing. He looked again. The body remained motionless. Surely he was imagining it. Fatigue, lights, muscle reflexes perhaps. He moved closer. The girl's face was still calm and pale, but then another slow movement. Her eyelashes trembled. 1, 2, blink. Ramiro froze. His heart began to beat fast and hard. "No, it can't be," he whispered. He touched her face with his hand. Her skin was warm, too warm. Suddenly a hoarse sound came from the young woman's throat, a short, weak moan, almost a sigh. Ramiro took a step back, unable to breathe. Holy God! The young woman moved her lips as if trying to speak, but nothing came out. Her fingers moved slightly on the sheet. The old doctor, guided by instinct, took her pulse firmly and felt a faint but real touch. A weak, irregular heartbeat, lost but alive. Ramiro's eyes widened, his whole body trembling. For years, he had lived with death every day. He thought nothing could surprise him anymore. But there, in front of that young woman who was returning from where no one returns, something inside him broke. "Code White emergency!" he shouted with a trembling voice, breaking the silence in the room. "She's alive! She's alive!" He ran to the wall and pressed the emergency button. The loud sound echoed through the hospital corridors. The door flew open, and the nurses rushed in. "What's going on, doctor?" one asked nervously. Ramiro pointed to the table. "She's not dead. She's breathing." The team moved quickly. One of them placed a stethoscope on the young woman's chest. She had a pulse, albeit a weak one. Within seconds, they arrived with the stretcher, its wheels screeching on the smooth floor as they carefully lifted the body. Ramiro followed them, sweating, his heart racing. In the hallway, the code white siren continued to sound. Doctors and nurses all looked confused. The young woman was rushed to the emergency room. "Hurry, please!" Ramiro shouted, without taking his eyes off her. Once inside the room, the sound of machines filled the place. They connected the IV. A green line began to move irregularly, trembling but alive. "There's activity!" shouted a nurse. Her pupils reacted to the light. Her body trembled slightly. She breathed with difficulty, like someone trying to get out of the water after nearly drowning. Ramiro rested his hands on the table. His chest rose and fell rapidly. His throat felt dry, his vision blurred. "My God," he whispered, "who are you?" While the nurses worked to connect tubes and adjust the IV, he stood there quietly watching. It was no longer a body. It was a life fighting to stay alive. The room was silent, broken only by the constant sound of the machines. The air smelled of disinfectant and medical attention. The young woman, still unconscious, was breathing with the help of the machines. Her face looked peaceful, but her body told a different story. Scratches, bruises, old marks of pain. A new nurse with tired eyes entered slowly. Her name was Julia. She was carrying a plastic bag with the things they had collected from the girl. A pair of worn sneakers, a torn blouse, and a pair of pants covered in dirt. Julia approached the table, opened the bag, and began to check everything, writing down notes on a form. It was a simple, automatic procedure, but when she touched the pants, something caught her attention. The fabric was hard with dirt, as if the girl had been sleeping on the street for days. Julia turned the pants carefully. There was a slight rustling sound. What's this?" she muttered. She pulled out a small piece of crumpled paper, almost stuck together with dried sweat. She opened it slowly, afraid of tearing it. The letters were blurred, written by hand, but she could read, "Clinica Renatzer, Calle 5, nothing else. No name, no phone number, no documents." Julia frowned. "Clinica Renatzer," she repeated under her breath. She had never heard of it. She looked around as if she expected someone to say something, but the only response was the rhythmic beeping of the monitor. Dr. Ramiro entered shortly after with a chart in his hand. "How is the patient?" he asked, his voice still hoarse from running. "She's stable for now," Julia replied. "Doctor, I found this in her pocket." She handed him the crumpled piece of paper. Ramiro took it carefully, as if it were something sacred. He read it slowly, moving his lips. "Renactor Clinic." He repeated the name, which hung in the air. "Calle 5. He turned the paper over, looking for a clue. Nothing, just that name and a blue line of ink, as if someone had wanted to erase something. No documents, no bag, nothing. "Nothing, doctor? Just this?" Ramiro remained silent for a few seconds, staring at the paper. It was little, almost nothing, but at that moment it seemed enough to ignite a spark within him. An address, a loose thread. He folded the paper carefully, put it in the file, and closed it. Then he approached the young woman and stared at her face under the cold hospital light. The strands of hair stuck to her forehead, her expression calm as if she were sleeping very deeply. He spoke softly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Someone was waiting for you in that place, right? What happened to you, girl?" Julia looked at him, not knowing what to say. The girl had no name, no story, but now she had something, A small clue, almost nothing, but enough to raise questions that no one there could silence again. Ramiro touched the paper again inside the pocket of his gown, as if guarding a secret, a simple piece of paper. The hospital corridor was full of hurried voices and loud footsteps on the tile floor. The air smelled of alcohol, medicine, and fear. Inside the observation room, the young woman was still fighting between life and emptiness. The white light reflected on her face, now covered in cables and tubes, and the sound of the monitor was the only sign that her heart was still beating. When the team came in to check the equipment, they were accompanied by a younger nurse in a clean gown with a calm face, at least until she saw the bed. Daniela, with her serene face and sweet gaze, froze at the door as if the floor had disappeared beneath her, her eyes fixed on the patient, her breath short. "Daniela, everything okay?" a colleague asked, not understanding, but she didn't answer. Her face suddenly turned pale, and the chart fell from her hands, making a sharp noise as it hit the floor. She put her hand to her mouth, her eyes filled with tears. Ramiro, who was nearby, turned around immediately. "What's wrong, nurse?" Daniela took a step back, her lips trembling as if she couldn't speak. "I know her," she whispered, her voice choked. The room fell silent. Everyone looked at each other. Ramiro approached slowly, trying to understand. "Do you know the patient?" She shook her head, not knowing whether to say yes or no. Tears began to run down her face. "I shouldn't," she whispered, almost without a voice. "I shouldn't know her." Ramiro looked at the other nurses and motioned for them to leave. When they were alone, he took off his gloves and said firmly but gently, "Talk to me, Daniela. Who is she?" "Her." Daniela tried to take a deep breath, but her voice came out broken. "Her name is Valeria," Ramiro frowned. "Valeria," she repeated, trying to remember a name, a file, where she knew her from. The nurse pressed her hands against her chest, trying not to cry. "We studied together at school when we were girls and teenagers. We were inseparable," she said, her voice breaking, until one day, she disappeared. "It's been about 10 years, but it's her." She sat on the edge of an empty stretcher next to her, staring at the floor, tears falling slowly, one by one. "We were 17, she continued. "We laughed about everything, talked about dreams, life, all that nonsense that you think you understand." Ramiro listened to her in silence, without interrupting. Daniela took a deep breath and continued. "One day she arrived different, quiet. I asked her what was wrong, but she just said, 'I'll tell you later,' and she never did." The sound of the heart monitor could be heard in the background, filling the gaps between words. Shortly after, she disappeared. Daniela looked at the floor, biting her lip. They said she left with an older man. No one knew if it was true. I looked for her, but nothing. She looked up at Valeria's expressionless face on the bed. "I thought she was dead, doctor. I swear." Her voice failed her, and she burst into tears. Ramiro stood still, as if the world had stopped for a second. He approached her and put his hand on her shoulder. "She's alive. Daniela is alive, thank God." Daniela nodded, wiping her face with the back of her hand, trying to calm down, but her emotions were stronger than her. She looked again at Valeria, lying there fragile, surrounded by wires. "I never thought I'd see her like this," she whispered so quietly. Ramiro took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what he had just learned. He slowly walked away, letting Daniela approach her friend. She gently touched the young woman's cold but living hand and stood there looking at her, as if asking for forgiveness for so many years of silence. Time seemed to stand still again, two broken lives meeting again in a hospital room, one because of pain and the other because of guilt, but now united by something that still had no name. The sun was already setting when Ramiro parked the car in front of the rusty gate. The address on the paper had led him here, one because of pain, the other because of guilt, but now, both united by something that still had no name. The sun was already setting when Ramiro parked the car in front of the rusty gate. The address on the paper had led him there, to a forgotten street with no people, where the houses seemed to have been left behind in time. The worn sign still hung from a crooked hook, Renaissance Clinic, 5th Street, but the letters were almost illegible. The wind blew through the cracks in the wood, making the door creak as if the house were breathing on its own. Ramiro sat still in the car for a few seconds, looking at the building in silence. The dirty glass of the windows reflected the orange sunset. He felt a slight chill, not from fear, but from a premonition. Something about that scene weighed heavily on him. He got out of the car slowly, the crumpled piece of paper still between his fingers. The ground was covered with dry leaves, each step making a crunching sound. There was graffiti on the walls and on the gate, an old sign saying "Closed property, no trespassing." Even so, he pushed the iron gate, which creaked loudly as it opened. The smell inside was one of dampness and abandonment. The entrance hall had broken tiles, pieces of glass on the floor, and a strange echo that doubled any sound. Ramiro turned on the flashlight on his cell phone. The light shook on the walls. There were still traces of blue paint and a faded mural with figures of babies and flowers. Under the dust, almost invisible letters said, "Here you are, born again. You are born again." He repeated softly, "Reborn." He walked a little further and passed a dust-covered counter where there were still old cards scattered on the floor. He picked one up. The paper was yellowed, the name already erased, but he could read the word "patient" in the upper corner. With each step, the sound of his shoes echoed as if the whole building could hear. The doors were open, revealing small rooms with iron beds, broken mattresses, and moldy sheets. In one corner, there was a doll with no arms, covered in dust. Ramiro stared at that doll for a while, as if it were telling a story that no one wanted to hear. His heart tightened in his chest. Suddenly, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around quickly. It was an elderly man with a hat who was watching him from the other side of the gate. "Don," said the man, approaching slowly. "Are you looking for something?" Ramiro put the paper in his pocket and replied, "I'm a doctor. I'm looking for information about this clinic. It was called Renaissance, right?" The old man nodded. "Yes, years ago, but it's no longer in operation. It closed 2 or 3 years ago, maybe." "Why did it close?" asked Ramiro. The man looked around and lowered his voice. "No one really knows. Some people came and took everything away. They said it was because of legal problems. Since then, it's been empty." Ramiro felt a chill down his spine. "And the girls who were here?" The old man took a deep breath. "Many young, pregnant women came here alone. Some left with their babies in their arms. Others stopped by, and others were never seen again." The silence that followed was heavy. Only the sound of the wind hitting the windows. Ramiro stared at the ground, the flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. No one ever came back to look for them. No one. The old man shook his head. Sometimes families came to ask, but the owners were already gone. No one told them anything. Ramiro looked up and looked at the building again. The sun was already disappearing behind the trees, leaving the place in a bluish, late afternoon hue. The man then commented almost in a whisper, "They say that at night you can hear crying inside, like a woman, but I don't believe that." Ramiro didn't answer. He just looked at the rusty gate, the name almost erased from the sign, and the dark hallway inside. For a moment, he thought of the young woman who was now sleeping in the hospital. He thought of the piece of paper found in his pocket at that forgotten address. The wind blew again, raising dust and leaves. Ramiro took a deep breath, put the paper in his pocket, and muttered to himself with a lump in his throat. "What happened to you, girl? What did you go through here?" And then he turned away, walking slowly to the car behind him. The gate creaked again, closing with a long, sad sound, as if the building were keeping its secrets once more. In the hospital, the room was silent, lit only by the soft light coming through the half-open window. The constant sound of machines filled the air, that beep-beep that marked the rhythm of life, a life that continued by sheer stubbornness, hanging by a thread. Valeria lay motionless, her face serene, almost pale, her hair falling on the white pillow, and her eyes, though closed, seemed to carry a great weight. The air conditioning blew cold air, and the sheet rose and fell slowly with each difficult breath. Ramiro entered slowly, holding the clipboard. The sound of his footsteps was light, as if he were afraid of waking her. He stood next to the bed and watched her for a moment. The light from the monitor reflected on his tired face. "You're alive," he murmured, as if talking to himself. "But what happened to you, girl?" He grabbed the tests and reviewed them calmly. The X-rays showed more than he expected. Old marks, a badly healed broken rib, a recent C-section scar, small but clear bruises on her abdomen. He closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. Daniela entered shortly after with a tray in her hand and a worried look on her face. "Doctor, change the IV. Now you can change it," she replied, without taking her eyes off the file. She approached the bed, carefully adjusting the tubes. The silence between the two was heavy, broken only by the sound of the IV dripping and the patient's heart beating slowly. Drip, and the patient's heart beating slowly. "Doctor," said Daniela in an almost guilty tone. "She still isn't saying anything or opening her eyes properly." Ramiro nodded. "She's not stable, but she's not responding." Daniela swallowed. "I noticed a scar on her stomach." Ramiro looked away with a serious expression. "Yes, a recent C-section. She had a baby." The doctor took a moment to respond. "Everything indicates that she did." Daniela remained silent, looking at the young woman in the bed, her eyes filled with tears. "Then where's the baby?" No one answered. The question hung in the air, heavy, as if bouncing off the walls. Ramiro left the clipboard on the table, walked to the window, and looked out at the street. The movement, the people rushing by, life going on without realizing that someone inside was fighting to come back. "We don't know," he said finally quietly. "There's no record, no paper, no name, nothing." Daniela looked again at Valeria, who looked as tired as if she had been running for a long time. Ramiro stared at the young woman's face, the discreet marks on her hands, the scratches on her wrists. "Tired? Yes," he murmured fearfully. The beeping of the machine continued steadily, but there was something distressing about that sound, as if each beat were asking for answers that no one had the courage to give. Daniela carefully adjusted the sheet and whispered close to Valeria's ear, "Valeria, if you can hear me, calm down. Yes, we're going to take care of you." A tear rolled down the corner of the young woman's eye. Daniela stood still. Dr. Ramiro approached and saw the tear all onto the pillow. His chest tightened. "She can hear you," he whispered, but she didn't speak. He held her hand. Her skin was cold, but there was life there. They stayed like that for a few seconds without words, only the patient's weak breathing and the sound of her heart trying to keep going. Ramiro looked at Daniela with tired eyes. "You had a baby, Daniela. I have no doubt about that." He paused. "The question is, where is it?" No one answered. The nurse turned her face away, trying not to cry. Ramiro lowered his head, not knowing if he felt anger, compassion, or guilt. Night began to fall. The evening light slowly disappeared, and the room grew darker and colder. In the corner, the folded piece of paper was still inside the file. The address of that phantom clinic now rang in the doctor's mind, like an open wound. Outside, the hospital continued at its usual pace. But there, in that room, time seemed to have stopped. Valeria breathed silently, and the air was filled with the question that no one wanted or knew how to answer. It was almost dawn when Ramiro entered the hospital's dead archive. The hallway was long and cold, filled with rusty shelves and cardboard boxes stacked up to the ceiling. The smell of dust and old paper mixed with the distant sound of ventilation machines. He carried a small flashlight and a folder with notes. The yellow light trembled in his hands, but his gaze was steady. His already hardened fingers ran over the old labels, 2018, 2019, 2020, until he stopped at a metal drawer with the worn letters Maternity 2025. He opened the drawer, and a sharp squeak was heard inside the stacks of files. Every story has a beginning. Ramiro took a deep breath, picked up a pile, and began to review the sheets. They were stained, some almost illegible. He read quickly, looking for something that made sense with that name that kept spinning around in his head, Valeria. A few minutes passed, until his eyes stopped on a yellowed file in the middle of the pile. The handwritten name, almost erased, seemed to scream in the silence. Valeria Avila, 27 years old, emergency delivery. Ramiro stood still, staring at those letters for a while, then sat down on the metal chair next to it and carefully opened the file. The records were clear. Date, 4 months ago. Type of delivery, Emergency C-section. Premature fetus, 7 months. Sex, male. Condition at birth, stable. Incubator, 48 hours. And in the field, baby's name, a detail that made him hold his breath. Gabriel murmured in a low voice, testing the name Gabriel. The sound seemed strange, almost sacred in that forgotten place. He stared at the paper, feeling the weight of that discovery, his body tired, his heart tight. There was something deeply human about holding that piece of paper, an entire life summarized in a few lines. At the bottom, a field was filled in with a pen. The mother requested voluntary discharge the next day and did not take the baby home. Rami, she frowned. She wanted to leave, but why? She checked the back of the form. Nothing. No explanation, no address, nothing. She picked up the old phone in the corner of the room and dialed the maternity ward extension. A sleepy voice answered. Maternity ward. Good evening. This is Dr. Castaneda from the coroner's office. I need a favor, he said, controlling his tone. Do me a favor. Look in the discharge records from 4 months ago. Name, Valeria Avila. He heard the sound of the keyboard on the other end. After a few seconds, the receptionist replied, Yes, doctor. Here it is. Admitted for premature birth. Discharged the next day without a companion. Ramiro clutched the paper between his fingers. She was discharged without the baby, doctor. But when the social worker went to visit, they said the child had been referred to a temporary home due to lack of a guardian. He closed his eyes. The silence of the file seemed to grow louder. The baby was alive somewhere. Only the receptionist continued talking, but he could hardly hear her. The name Gabriel pulsed in his head, as if each heartbeat repeated it. Then he hung up the phone slowly and remained still, his tired face resting on his hand. The sound of the clock marked the seconds, and the flashlight trembled on the table. He took the file and ran his finger over the mother's name, Valeria Avila, and just below, the son's, Gabriel. 2 names united by an almost invisible thread, a mother and son separated by something that no one understood yet. The doctor got up slowly, put the paper in his coat pocket, and left the archive. The hallway was empty, and the whole hospital was asleep. But in his head, the voices wouldn't stop. She was discharged the next day. She didn't take the baby. She walked to the window at the end of the hallway. The city outside seemed distant, covered by a light fog. She stood there looking at the lights and thinking about the baby who must be sleeping in some borrowed crib. A baby with no arms to hug him, no mother's name, and Valeria now lying in a cold bed, lost within herself. Ramiro ran his hand over his face and took a deep breath. Gabriel, he repeated softly. Gabriel, and for the first time in many years, he felt his heart ache in a different way, not as a doctor, but as a man. The clock in the room read almost 10 p.m. when Daniela slowly entered, pushing the door open with her shoulder. The lights were dim, and the hospital was already asleep. The hallway outside was silent, except for the distant sound of the night guard's footsteps. She was carrying a bottle of water and a small bouquet she had bought on her way out of the pharmacy. She stopped in front of the bed. Valeria lay motionless, her face too calm for someone who had lived so long. The cold air caused the sheet to move slightly with each breath. Daniela approached, placed the flowers in a plastic cup, and stood there looking at them for a moment. She couldn't say anything. The words stuck in her throat, and the silence seemed larger than the room. She sat down on the chair next to the bed and took the corner of the sheet, as if she needed to touch something to believe it was real. "Hello, Val," she whispered in a low, trembling voice. "It's me, Daniela." The name seemed to float in the air. No response, no movement. Daniela took a deep breath. Her eyes began to fill with tears. "I know if you can hear me," she continued in a weak voice. "But I had to come." She lowered her head and remained silent for a few seconds, trying not to cry. Then she slowly looked up, her eyes already filled with tears. "You know what's the strangest thing?" she said with a sad smile. "I spend all day caring for sick people, trying to save lives. And yet when I saw you there in that state, my mind went blank. I just cried." The tears began to fall slowly, hot. Daniela wiped one away with the sleeve of her gown, but more came. "I should have done something. I should have looked for you sooner." "You don't know," she said angrily to herself. You were my friend, my best friend, and I let you drift away. I let people talk about you." She let out a short, bitter laugh. "Do you remember? We used to laugh about everything. We made plans. You said you wanted to be a singer. I said I was going to be a nurse. And we swore we were going to be moms at the same time." Her voice broke. Yes. The room grew even quieter. Daniela took a deep breath, trying to calm down, but she couldn't. "I got pregnant too, Val," she confessed, looking at the floor. "No one knows. Not even my mom." The sound of her confession broke the silence. She rested her face in her hands and cried softly. "I lost the baby," she continued, looking at the floor. "No one knows. Not even my mom," she confessed, looking at the floor. "I was 18. No one knows. Not even my mom." The sound of her confession broke the air. She rested her face in her hands and cried softly. "I lost the baby," she continued between sobs. 2 months. I didn't even know what I was feeling. I just remember the pain, and then the emptiness. A silence that stayed inside me. "Look," she tapped her chest. It never went away. She looked at Valeria again with red eyes. "Maybe that's why it hurt so much to see you lying there," she said with a broken voice. "Because I saw in you what I could have been. Alone, afraid, lost." She got up, went to the window, and looked at the city outside. The lights flickered. Small. "Sometimes I think God puts us back in the same place to fix what went wrong," she murmured, almost to herself. "Maybe that's it. Maybe now it's my turn to take care of you." She came back to the bed and took Valeria's hand carefully. Her fingers were cold, but alive. Daniela ran her thumb slowly over her skin in an old gesture of affection, like when two friends comfort each other without speaking. "Forgive me, Val," she whispered, "for not staying, for not asking what happened, for believing what they said." Tears fell, and her voice was a whisper. "I should have defended you. I saw you." The sound of the monitor filled the space, that constant beep reminding her that despite everything, there was life there. Daniela closed her eyes and took a deep breath, letting the tears flow. "If you can hear me, come back," she said softly. "Come back. I'm here." She stayed like that for a while, holding her hand in silence. The clock ticked away a few more minutes. Outside, the hospital continued at its usual pace, but inside, time seemed different. Daniela wiped her face, smoothed the sheet, and stared at her friend as if promising something without saying it out loud. "We still have a lot to talk about," she murmured. "I'll wait for you." And then she rested her head on the edge of the bed, still holding that fragile hand, and stayed there crying, asking for forgiveness without words. The sound of her tears mixed with the sound of Valeria's heart, two different rhythms but united by the same pain, the same loss, the same love that time could not erase. Dawn was falling on the hospital, and the silence felt heavier than ever. The lights in the hallway flickered from time to time, and the sound of the wall clock was the only thing that dared to break the still air. Ramiro walked slowly, his hands in the pockets of his gown, and his gaze lost. The shift was quiet, but his mind had not been for days. Something inside him had been stirring, an old feeling almost forgotten since he saw that girl alive on the cold table. His heart had never been the same. He passed the autopsy room, looked at the scalpel stored on the tray, and looked away. He climbed the stairs to the top floor where the old archive was located, a place that almost no one visited. The key made a sharp sound in the lock. The air inside was thick and dusty, as if time had stopped. The shelves were full of old boxes and folders. Ramiro turned on the light. The yellowish glow barely illuminated the room, but it was enough. He walked to the back of the room to a corner hidden behind a metal cabinet. Underneath it, a pile of folders. There was an old wooden box marked by time. He stood there for a few seconds, just looking at it, then slowly knelt down and pulled it toward him. His hands were shaking. Dust rose into the air, and the smell brought back memories he had spent years trying to bury. He carefully opened the lid. Inside, there were few things: a small plastic toy, a hospital bracelet with almost faded letters, and a photo, a simple yellowed photograph with folded corners. In the photo was a smiling boy with dark hair and lively eyes, wearing a blue shirt. He looked about 8 years old. Ramiro ran his finger slowly over the boy's face, as if he wanted to feel skin that was no longer there. "Hello, my boy." He whispered the boy's name. It still hurt his throat. Gabriel. The memory came back completely, like a wave he could never stop. The hospital, the despair, the body with fever in his arms, the race through the corridors, the rapid breathing, himself giving the wrong medicine, confident, hurried, and then the silence, his wife's gaze, the wordless pain, the scream that filled the corridor. Ramiro closed his eyes, pressing the photo against his chest. The guilt never went away. He just learned to live with it. "It was my fault," he murmured, his voice trembling, "and all mine." From that day on, he never again did he touch a living patient. He asked for a transfer and became a coroner. He told himself it was safer to work with those who could no longer die there among the dead. He believed he could hide from his own pain, but the truth is that pain never left him in peace. With his eyes filled with tears, he slowly got up, resting his hand on the table. The photo was still between his fingers. The air felt heavier and his chest hurt. He looked toward the window where the reflection showed a tired man with gray hair and a broken gaze. "I didn't save my son," he said in a whisper, "but maybe I can still do something right." He looked down again at the photo. The child's smile seemed alive, as if he were forgiving him without saying a word. Ramiro took a deep breath, put the photo in his coat pocket, and closed the box. He stood there for a while, staring at the floor, trying to swallow his sadness. The sound of the clock in the hallway filled the air again, marking the hours that would never return. At that moment, he understood why life had put Valeria in his path, but he said nothing, not even to himself. He just turned off the light, locked the door to the archive, and went downstairs in silence. His eyes filled with tears, and the photo pressed against his chest. For the first time in many years, he felt his heart beating differently. Not as a doctor, but as a father. Dawn was falling over the hospital, and the silence felt heavier than ever. The lights in the hallway flickered from time to time, and the sound of the wall clock was the only thing that dared to break the still air. Ramiro walked slowly, his hands in the pockets of his gown, and his gaze lost. The shift was quiet, but his head had not been for days. Something inside had been stirring, an old feeling, almost forgotten since he saw that girl alive on the cold table. His heart had never been the same. He passed by the autopsy room, looked at the scalpel stored in the tray, and looked away. He climbed the stairs to the top floor where the old archive was located, a place almost no one visited. The key made a sharp sound in the lock. The air inside was thick, full with dust, as if time had stopped. The shelves were covered with old boxes and folders. Ramiro turned on the light. The yellowish glow barely illuminated the place, but it was enough. He walked to the back of the room to a corner hidden behind a metal cabinet. There, under a pile of folders, was an old wooden box marked by time. He stood there for a few seconds, just looking at it, then knelt down slowly and pulled it toward him. His hands were shaking. Dust rose into the air, and the smell brought back memories he had been trying to bury for years. He carefully opened the lid. Inside were a few things: a small plastic toy, a hospital bracelet with almost faded letters, and a photo, a simple yellowed photograph with bent corners. In the photo was a smiling boy with dark hair and lively eyes, wearing a blue shirt. He must have been about 8 years old. Ramiro ran his finger slowly over the boy's face, as if he wanted to feel the skin that was no longer there. "Hello, my boy." He whispered the boy's name. It still hurt in his throat. Gabriel. The memory came back completely, like a wave he could never contain. The hospital, the desperation, his son's feverish body in his arms, the rush through the hallways, the rapid breathing, himself applying the wrong medication, confident, hurried, and then the silence, his wife's gaze, the wordless pain, the scream that echoed through the hallway. Ramiro closed his eyes, pressing the photo to his chest. The guilt never went away. He just learned to live with it. "It was my fault," he murmured, his voice trembling. "All mine." From that day on, he never touched a living patient again. He requested a transfer and became a coroner, telling himself it was safer to deal with those who could no longer die there among the dead. He thought he could hide from his own pain, but the truth is that it never left him alone. With his eyes full of tears, He slowly got up, resting his hand on the table. The photograph was still between his fingers. The air seemed heavier, and his chest hurt. He looked toward the window, where the reflection showed a tired man with gray hair and a broken gaze. "I didn't save my son," he said in a whisper, "but maybe I can still do something right." He looked down, again at the photo. The child's smile seemed alive, as if he were forgiving him without saying a word. Ramiro took a deep breath, put the photo in his robe pocket, and closed the box. He stood there for a while, staring at the floor, trying to swallow his sadness. The sound of the clock in the hallway could be heard again, marking the hours that would never return, and in that moment, he understood why life had put Valeria in his path. But he said nothing, not even to himself. He just turned off the light, locked the door to the archive, and went downstairs in silence, his eyes moist, and the photograph pressed against his chest. For the first time in many years, he felt his heart beating differently, not as a doctor, but as a father. The day dawned gray, the sky heavy, as if the world were holding its breath. Ramiro parked the car slowly in front of the shelter. The faded letters on the facade read, Casa Esperanza, House of Hope, and the light blue gate was peeling. The sound of children playing came from inside. Laughter, little footsteps, toys hitting the floor. In the back seat, Valeria looked out the window, her hair falling loosely over her face, her hands trembling in her lap, breathing deeply, but she felt like she couldn't get enough air. Daniela held her hand without saying anything. Ramiro turned off the engine, looked at them both, and said quietly, his voice firm but full of emotion, "Are you ready?" Valeria felt her eyes fill with tears. "I'm scared," she confessed, almost in a whisper. "What if she doesn't recognize me?" Daniela squeezed her hand tighter. "She'll recognize you, Val. Love never forgets the smell of a mother." The gate opened slowly, making a noise. A middle-aged woman appeared in a white coat with a friendly smile. "Dr. Castañeda?" asked Ramiro. He nodded. "That's us." The woman opened the gate wider. "Please come in." The three of them entered. The yard was simple, littered with toys. The air smelled of milk and soap. Children ran between the benches, laughing. Valeria looked at everything as if she were walking in a dream that seemed impossible. The caregiver took them to room 4, painted light yellow. In the corner, there was a wooden crib. A young caregiver was holding a baby in her arms, singing softly. "It's him," said the woman with a discreet smile. Gabriel Valeria stopped at the door. Time seemed to stand still. Her legs were shaking. She took one step, then another. The baby was awake. He had deep, dark eyes and was looking at the ceiling with that calm curiosity of those who do not yet know fear. Ramiro felt a lump in his throat. Daniela discreetly raised her cell phone, recording, but what was seen there was not a scene. It was something that time cannot invent. Valeria approached the crib slowly, without haste. Each step was a memory that returned. The touch on her belly, the first little kick, the distant crying. She stopped in front of him and knelt down with trembling hands. The caregiver looked at Ramiro, who nodded silently. Then she placed the baby in Valeria's arms. For a moment everything stopped. The air, the sound of the children outside, her own heart. Valeria held him, not knowing what to do first, whether to cry, to speak, or just to breathe. The baby looked at her with a direct, clear, curious gaze. He didn't cry. He just rested his little head on her chest, as if recognizing that place. Valeria brought her hand to her mouth, the crying coming out like a sob held back for months. "My love," she whispered through her tears. "My little one, my life." Her whole body was shaking. Each tear was an apology, a little piece of pain coming out of her chest. She kissed him on the forehead, on the cheeks, on his soft hair. "Forgive me, my love," she repeated, as if the baby could understand. "Forgive me for not being there, for not having the strength." Our Ramiro turned his face away, trying to hide what he was feeling, but the tears came anyway, falling silently down the wrinkles of his tired face. Daniela lowered her cell phone and also cried, without hiding. The scene in front of them was so human that no words could fit there. Valeria rocked the baby gently, the sound of his crying mingling with his soft breathing. "I looked for you in my dreams," she said softly. "Everyday days, every day. The baby closed his eyes and let out a soft sigh, his little head still resting on her chest, as if the world had finally returned to the right place. Ramiro took a step back, trying to hold back his emotions. His heart ached. There was something sacred about this scene, a mother and son reunited after the abyss. Valeria looked at him and whispered with a trembling voice, "Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for not giving up." He shook his head, unable to respond. The words simply wouldn't come out. The caregiver standing at the door also wiped her eyes. Daniela held her cell phone to her chest as if she wanted to keep that moment inside her. Valeria looked at her son again, and a shy smile appeared through her tears. "I promise you," she said firmly for the first time, "I will never let you go again." The baby moved his little hand, gently touching her chin. Valeria laughed through her tears. "Yes, I know," she replied emotionally. "I know who I am now." Silence returned, and only the sound of their breathing filled the room. Two hearts beating at the same rhythm after all. Daniela stepped forward and put her hand on Valeria's shoulder, whispering, "He waited for you, Val." Valeria smiled, her eyes shining with a love that hurt and healed at the same time. "And I waited for him too," she said, looking at her son. Ramiro, in the corner of the room, ran his hand over his face and took a deep breath. He had a lump in his throat that wouldn't go away, and he knew it wasn't necessary. This wasn't just a reunion, it was a rebirth. The evening light streamed through the window, illuminating the three of them, mother, son, and friend, with a soft, golden glow. Ramiro watched in silence as the tears slowly dried. It was as if time itself had stopped to watch, and for a moment, all the weight of the world seemed to disappear, leaving only the sweet sound of life passing by again. The hospital. Wake up early. The hallway smells of weak coffee and disinfectant. The noise of the wheels on the stretchers scratches. Valeria arrives before sunrise wearing a simple gown, her hair tied back as best she can, and a shiny new badge on her chest. She takes a deep breath at the door of the station, her hands sweating. Daniela appears behind her and puts her forehead against hers, laughing softly. "Hey, breathe," she says, adjusting the gown. "You look beautiful, and you're ready." "I'm afraid of making a mistake," Valeria admits in a low voice. "Making mistakes is part of it," Daniela says, touching her shoulder. "But you love, and those who love take good care." Valeria enters. The white light in the hallway looks different today. She pushes the cart of sheets, greets the rooms, helps a lady sit down, gives a glass of water to a man with trembling hands, changes a patient's diaper with the patience of someone who learned to speak with silence. "Thank you, daughter," says the lady with teary eyes. Valeria smiles, a shy but complete smile. Between one change and another, she looks out the window and thinks of Gabriel. Her chest warms. The day continues simply, with small acts of care that no one sees, but that sustain the world. In the afternoon at the shelter, Gabriel sleeps in his wooden crib. Ramiro enters slowly, wearing a cap. The doorman knows him and opens the gate with a greeting. He carries a cloth rattle in his pocket and an apple in his hand. "Good afternoon, my champion," he whispers as he approaches. The baby opens his eyes and stretches out his little hand as if he recognizes the sound of the voice. Ramiro laughs softly, that short laugh of someone who cries inside. He sits down on the couch and picks up the child, carefully, his back bent with an old tenderness. "Today I brought you music," he says, shaking the rattle. Look, Gabriel." He lets out a sound that is not quite a laugh, but almost. For a moment, the shadow in Ramiro's eyes disappears. He kisses the little head and closes his eyes, feeling the light weight in his arm, a warmth that stitches up an old hole in his chest. "Thank you," he murmurs softly to no one and to everyone. "Thank you for letting me come sometimes." Daniela arrives with a pack of diapers and a blanket with clouds drawn on it. On one of those visits, seeing them, she jokes, "I'm watching you, huh?" She points to Gabriel. "This kid has 2 moms and a very indulgent grandfather." Ramiro laughs, discreetly wiping his eye. "You're spoiling him, Grandpa." A simple day becomes a day of promises in the courtyard with the peach-colored sky and the gentle wind. Valeria takes Daniela's hand and puts a blue ribbon on her wrist like a child's bow. "This child, and you are his godmother," she says in a firm voice. Daniela stands still, surprised, the ribbon moving in the wind. Then she hugs both things at the same time, the ribbon and her friend. "I promise," she says slowly, as if signing in the air. "I promise to stay on good days and bad days, on feverish days and days of laughter. I promise." Valeria puts her forehead against Daniela's, and the two breathe in unison. Gabriel, in her arms, squeezes Daniela's finger with his little hand. The days pass and become routine. Valeria changes bandages, learns to make beds with the perfect corner, brings warm soup to those who have no visitors. Her way of being is simple: a hand that cleans, an eye that sees the pain, a mouth that says everything is fine without the need for long words. Those who see her from afar think she is insignificant, but those who feel her closeness know that she is the world. And then, one Tuesday afternoon, the dining room is full. Trays clatter, conversations buzz. The smell of rice and beans fills the air. On the wall next to the water fountain, someone has placed a simple, handmade card. Plain paper, blue pen, no drawings, just large letters with pauses, as if the writer's hand was shaking. "Thank you for not giving up on me, Doctor. You gave me and him our lives back." Ramiro sees her from afar. The noise of the dining room fades away. The letters shine, as if they had their own light. He reaches out his hand and touches the edge of the paper to make sure it exists. He reads it again, more slowly, word by word, as if chewing on each syllable, and repeats it softly to himself. His eyes fill with tears. He doesn't hide them. The tears run down his lined face and fall into the corners of his mouth. They taste of salt and peace. He leans his hand against the wall to keep from staggering. Many people look, some smile, others pretend not to see out of respect. Daniela arrives from behind him. She reads it too. She turns away to hide her tears and taps him on the arm, as if to say, "You deserve it." "It was her, wasn't it?" she whispers. "It was," he replies in a raspy voice. Valeria enters the dining room with her tray. She sees the two of them standing in front of the paper. She says nothing, just stands silently beside them. Ramiro takes her hand for just a second, like a father who never learned to say everything with words but did with touch. Daniela takes his other hand, and there, amid the clatter of cutlery and the smell of coffee, the three of them remain broken, yes, but together, and that's how the pieces begin to fall into place. That night, at the end of her shift, Valeria goes through the rooms and carefully turns off the lights. Before leaving, she looks at the empty hallway and gives thanks inside for her simple job, for her son who breathes peacefully, for the friend who stayed, for the man who saw the impossible and believed. Perhaps no one there understands how great that is, but the hospital feels it. The walls, the hallways, the cold beds, everything becomes a little warmer where love passes. And if it were you, would you let someone without a name leave without trying to know their story? If this story touched you, comment and subscribe for more real stories that heal from within.